The history books, penned by the victors and polished by the bureaucracy of Whitehall, present the destruction of the Spanish silver fleet at Santa Cruz de Tenerife in April 1657 as an inevitable, if audacious, triumph of English naval might. It is frequently framed as the glorious zenith of Admiral Robert Blake's career, a tale of luck meeting courage, leading to the destruction of an entire enemy treasure convoy within its own supposedly impenetrable fortress harbor. This accepted narrative is, however, not merely an oversimplification. It is a deliberate intellectual slight, obscuring the grim reality and the profound genius of the act. We are asked to believe that one of the most heavily fortified, naturally defended harbors in the Spanish global network could be breached by chance. This is a fallacy. To view the action at Tenerife merely as a heroic skirmish is to fundamentally misunderstand the geopolitical landscape of the mid-17th century and the catastrophic risks undertaken by Blake. It was not a foregone conclusion. It was a desperate gamble against impossible odds, a calculated act of warfighting doctrine that few of his contemporaries in the Admiralty could comprehend, let alone support. The prevailing consensus among the conservative naval establishment held that engaging shore batteries with ships was not just reckless, but a violation of core military principle. Yet, Blake did precisely that, sailing a limited force into the mouth of what was effectively a cannon line trap. The official story fails to account for the systemic failure within the English supply chain, the active political resistance Blake faced from within Cromwell's own Council of State, and the abysmal state of the health of the Admiral himself. These factors conspired not to aid Blake, but to nearly ensure his disaster. The victory was achieved not because of the might of the Commonwealth, but often in spite of it. This documentary will challenge the comfortable, sanitized narrative of naval infallibility. We must look past the subsequent political spin to understand the true dynamics of the conflict. The success at Tenerife was not an accident of history, it was the clinical, cold-blooded execution of a radical new doctrine of naval warfare, conceived by a commander already facing death, executed by men who knew retreat was impossible, and aimed at the rotten, silver-filled heart of the Spanish global economic system. The destruction of the fleet was a masterpiece of military strategy, yes, but it was also a moment of profound political vulnerability for England, a vulnerability masked by the smoke and fire of a destroyed enemy convoy. Blake's genius lay not only in defeating the Spanish, but in temporarily silencing the powerful, self-serving factions in London who had hoped his hubris would lead him to ruin. It is time to peel back the layers of propaganda and examine the Tenerife anomaly for what it truly was, an audacious near catastrophe turned to victory by a forgotten doctrine and a genius facing down political treachery. The 1657 raid on Tenerife, while an act of martial genius, cannot be understood solely as a naval engagement. It was the explosive result of a geopolitical calculus rooted in economic desperation and systemic corruption within the highest levels of the English Commonwealth. The Anglo-Spanish War, 1654–1660, was not simply a religious or dynastic conflict, but a cold, transactional war for the global currency of silver. In the 1650s, the Spanish Empire, though geographically vast, was financially brittle. Its power was entirely predicated on the annual influx of bullion from the Americas via the Carrera de Indias, the great silver convoys. For any European power seeking to challenge global hegemony, disrupting this supply chain was not merely profitable, it was the strategic equivalent of economic decapitation. Across the Channel, the newly established, precarious English Commonwealth, led by the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, desperately needed legitimacy and, critically, money. The costly wars of the Three Kingdoms and the maintenance of a powerful new model army had emptied the treasury. While Cromwell was motivated by a genuine Protestant zeal, seeing the Catholic Spanish Empire as the great obstacle to divine providence, the political reality was far more cynical. The war offered a means to refill the coffers without resorting to unpopular domestic taxation, simultaneously uniting disparate political factions under the banner of foreign conquest. The true genesis of the war, however, lay within the Council of State, the rotten heart of Whitehall. This body was a viper's nest of powerful figures, many of whom were less concerned with the Commonwealth's security and more with personal enrichment. These men, often former merchants or rising gentry, recognized that the war provided unprecedented opportunities for privateering, land speculation in the Caribbean, the Western design, and the granting of lucrative supply contracts. They were not ideologues, they were cynical speculators. The decision to target the Spanish silver fleet, therefore, became a complex political trade-off. For Cromwell, it was a strike for God and country. For the powerful commercial interests in his council, it was a strike for unfathomable personal wealth. This created an environment of political treachery. Those who publicly supported the war often privately sabotaged expeditions, like the failed initial assault on Hispaniola, or, as Blake would later discover, deliberately hampered logistical support for commands they deemed too successful or too independent. Admiral Blake, an outsider to this courtly game, was the essential, high-risk instrument of this policy. His success in dismantling Spanish maritime power was directly beneficial to the financial stability of the regime, yet his unorthodox methods and moral incorruptibility made him a threat to the self-serving political class. The pursuit of the Silver Fleet was thus the political expression of a desperate English government attempting to steal the lifeblood of its rival, a transaction that guaranteed both immense profit for the few and profound risk for the men on the ships. The war was born of a strategic necessity married to the systemic corruption of an elite whose eyes were fixed not on the national flag, but on the flow of New World silver. To truly grasp the audaciousness of Blake's planned assault, one must first understand the object of his obsession, the Spanish Silver Fleet, or the Carrera de Indias. This was not merely a collection of merchant vessels, it was the most vital, rigorously organized, and heavily defended economic engine in the 17th century world. The fleet represented the lifeblood of the Spanish crown, a systemic flow of wealth that financed its armies, sustained its diplomatic influence, and buttressed its vast, sprawling empire. Without this silver, the colossal edifice of Habsburg power would instantly crumble. The system itself was a marvel of early global logistics. Twice yearly, convoys, one to Veracruz, the Flota, and one to Cartagena and Portobello, the Gale ones, would carry European goods to the New World. They would then load the immense wealth extracted from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas, primarily silver, but also gold, spices, and precious materials. This returning treasure was then gathered in Havana before sailing in a single, massive, fortified convoy back across the Atlantic. The Spanish considered the loss of this unified fleet, this singular impossible prize, to be a national catastrophe, hence the staggering resources poured into its defense. The value of this annual treasure was beyond measure, consistently accounting for over 20% of the Spanish crown's total income. In contemporary terms, the quantity of silver was so vast that its very arrival dictated the flow of credit and the stability of currencies across London, Amsterdam, Genoa, and Lisbon. The capture or destruction of this fleet was, therefore, the single most powerful act of economic warfare possible, a blow that bypassed armies and blockades to strike directly at the enemy's solvency. It is this context that elevates the location of the attack, Santa Cruz de Tenerife, from a simple harbor to an unassailable bastion. Spanish doctrine dictated that the treasure should only ever be unloaded in a safe, fortified location like Cadiz. The fact that the entire fleet was sheltering in a secondary, heavily reinforced port indicated an unusual level of distress and urgency, a temporary weakness Blake intended to exploit. Santa Cruz was considered impregnable for two primary reasons: topography and fortification. The harbor itself is a deep, narrow crescent, surrounded on three sides by towering, rugged volcanic terrain. A naval vessel entering the bay faced a constricted firing arc, preventing it from maneuvering or fully bringing its broadside to bear. Furthermore, the Spanish had established a formidable network of interlocking stone fortresses. The principal defenses were the Castle of San Cristóbal and the Castle of San Juan Bautista, or the Black Fortress, positioned perfectly to command the entrance and dominate the inner harbor. These forts, mounted with heavy cannon, fired from positions high above the waterline, giving them a devastating advantage over the lower-lying decks of the English warships. The accepted wisdom of the age was unanimous: ships cannot successfully engage high-angle shore batteries. The fleet, anchored within this natural and man-made fortress, was not merely protected, it was imprisoned by its own defenses. It required an enemy commander to abandon every established naval doctrine, to disregard the accepted ratio of ship-to-fortress firepower, and to risk his entire fleet in a desperate gambit. The prize was indeed impossible, yet Blake saw not an obstacle, but a weakness in the very confidence of the Spanish, a hubris rooted in the belief that their fortifications rendered them safe from any conceivable attack. Robert Blake was, in the rigid institutional view of the 17th-century Admiralty, an anomaly, an outsider whose rapid ascent was a source of deep resentment among the established naval officer class. He was not a mariner by trade. He was a land soldier who had served the parliamentarian cause with distinction during the Civil War, defending Lyme Regis and Taunton with a tenacity that revealed his defining characteristic, an absolute refusal to be beaten by superior odds. This background was crucial, for it meant Blake was unburdened by the conservative doctrines and traditions that shackled career naval commanders. He approached the sea not with the cautious reverence of the sailor, but with the aggressive pragmatism of a siege engineer. Before Tenerife, Blake's reputation was already one of controversy and unorthodox success. His early naval appointments saw him transform the fledgling Commonwealth fleet into a formidable fighting force, yet his methods were consistently met with skepticism. The great victories at Portland, 1653, and the Mediterranean campaign culminating in the destruction of Barbary privateers at Porto Farina, 1655, were not simply matters of bravery. They were exhibitions of a radical, developing doctrine that few understood. The core of Blake's strategic philosophy, which flew directly in the face of established naval wisdom, rested on two key principles. First, an aggressive, near-land tactics approach to ship-to-ship combat, emphasizing the continuous, coordinated firing of the broadside at close range to achieve rapid, overwhelming fire superiority. This contrasted sharply with the more cautious, maneuvering-focused approach preferred by traditional admirals. Second, and most relevant to Tenerife, was his belief that shore defenses were not inviolable. The successful destruction of the Tunisian shore batteries at Porto Farina 2 years prior was Blake's critical, forgotten precedent. He proved that by sailing directly up to a fortification, the higher elevation of the shore cannon, which usually offered an advantage, could be neutralized. At extremely close range, the heavy guns of a first-rate warship could target the lower stone courses and embrasures of the fort, achieving a level of structural damage and crew suppression that was deemed impossible by his peers. This repeated demonstration of unorthodox genius earned Blake a complex reputation. To the common sailors and the protector Cromwell, he was the unyielding hero whose victories funded the state and secured its borders. But among the professional naval captains, the old guard who measured their worth in decades spent at sea, he was viewed with suspicion and institutional resistance. They saw his audacity not as calculated genius, but as reckless endangerment of state assets, and his doctrine as an affront to centuries of maritime tradition. This internal antagonism manifested as the systemic incompetence and betrayal detailed in the previous chapter. When Blake proposed the attack on the notoriously fortified Santa Cruz, his plan was met with passive aggression and delays, the deliberate actions of those within Whitehall who hoped his hubris would finally lead to a catastrophic failure, thereby validating their conservative, risk-averse worldview and allowing them to reassert control over naval policy. Blake was thus sent to Tenerife, not just to fight the Spanish, but to prove the viability of his forgotten doctrine against both the enemy's cannon and the institutional myopia of his own government. He was an unsung strategist, destined to execute the greatest feat of his age while simultaneously battling the forces of betrayal and traditionalism at home. Admiral Blake's proposal to assault Santa Cruz was met with profound skepticism, verging on outright hostility, not because of a lack of courage within the English Admiralty, but due to a dogmatic adherence to outdated naval doctrine, a form of institutional myopia that nearly crippled the expedition before it began. For centuries, the accepted wisdom governing maritime warfare dictated a clear, immutable principle: ships do not successfully engage shore batteries. This principle was born of cold, hard physics. A stone fortification allowed for the mounting of heavy-caliber cannon on stable, high platforms, giving the guns superior range and a devastating plunging fire trajectory against the lower, rolling decks of a wooden warship. The fort's structure, built of thick masonry, could absorb damage that would instantly splinter the hull of a frigate. Therefore, the established, conservative strategy of naval warfare was to employ blockade, to patiently starve the enemy or intercept their fleets on the open sea, not to commit ships to a destructive frontal assault. Blake's proposed strategy, rooted in his prior success at Porto Farina, was seen as a reckless violation of this foundational precept. His plan was not merely aggressive, it was heretical. It called for sailing directly into the throat of the harbor, accepting the initial volleys, and then maneuvering into such close range that the high-mounted Spanish guns would be unable to depress sufficiently to hit the English ships' hulls, while the English broadsides could hammer the fort's embrasures and gun crews. This required a level of precision, speed, and audacity that traditionalists found unthinkable. The Admiralty and the influential conservative figures within Cromwell's Council of State dismissed the plan as adventurous lunacy. Their opposition was documented in specific, often heated, memoranda that emphasized the economic risk to the fleet, the Commonwealth's most expensive military asset. They argued that even a partial failure would leave England vulnerable to Dutch or French opportunism. This resistance was less about Spanish strength and more about preserving their own professional authority and avoiding political accountability for a high-stakes gamble. The architects of this opposition were typically career naval officers and cautious, landed gentry who had no stomach for Blake's puritanical zeal and radical thinking. They viewed Blake, the land soldier turned admiral, as an upstart whose previous successes were due to luck rather than sound strategy. Their critique was focused and venomous. They argued that the complex wind and tide patterns of Santa Cruz made a controlled entry and, crucially, a controlled exit impossible, guaranteeing the ships would be trapped and annihilated. This institutional myopia had immediate, tangible consequences. The opposition manifested not as an outright refusal, but as a crippling, passive-aggressive obfuscation of logistical support. Chapter 7 will detail how essential supplies, gunpowder, replacement masts, and specialized equipment were delayed, reduced in quantity, or substituted with inferior materials. The hope of these detractors was that Blake's failure could be attributed to either his own rashness or the inevitable consequences of poor supply, thereby allowing them to evade responsibility for the crippling delays they orchestrated. Blake was acutely aware that he was not just fighting the formidable Spanish defense, he was fighting the deep-seated inertia and self-serving caution of his own political masters. His success, therefore, had to be absolute and undeniable, a victory so profound that it would shatter the conservative naval doctrine forever and expose the hypocrisy of the political maneuvering back in Whitehall. The success at Santa Cruz was not an isolated act of impulsive bravery. It was the clinical, high-stakes validation of Robert Blake's radical naval doctrine, a set of principles developed during his Mediterranean campaigns and honed specifically to defeat fixed defenses in enclosed spaces. This doctrine, largely forgotten or dismissed by naval historians prioritizing fleet actions, was the essential blueprint for victory against the impossible odds of Tenerife. It was a fusion of his military background and his deep, albeit unorthodox, understanding of naval gunnery. Blake's strategic philosophy can be distilled into the principle of focused aggression in the closed theater. Unlike the established naval doctrine which favored maintaining distance from the shore to allow for maneuvering, Blake mandated the deliberate closing of the range to the point-blank extreme. He argued that the perceived strength of the shore battery, its high elevation and stable platform, became its greatest weakness at short range. A high-mounted cannon could not effectively depress its muzzle to hit a ship's hull directly when the vessel was immediately beneath the ramparts. This tactical inversion forced the fort's gunners to either fire over the ships or attempt high-angle plunging fire, both of which were inherently less accurate and less destructive than a direct hit. To exploit this, Blake's doctrine focused intensely on gunnery discipline and standardized ordnance. His crews were drilled relentlessly to maintain a far higher rate of fire than their Spanish counterparts. While Spanish gunners often employed slower, more deliberate techniques, Blake demanded continuous, rapid broadsides. This maximized the shock effect and, more importantly, quickly suppressed the enemy. The constant torrent of English shot was designed not just to destroy the fortification, but to psychologically paralyze the Spanish gun crews, preventing them from reloading and maintaining their fire rate. Furthermore, Blake established a sophisticated, almost industrial approach to ship armament. He favored ships carrying heavy cannon, culverins and demiculverins, that could deliver a devastating concentrated weight of metal. In a closed theater like the harbor, where ship-to-ship maneuver was limited, the key was not speed, but the density of instantaneous firepower delivered by the broadside. His strategy was to effectively turn his line of ships into a single, mobile siege battery. The Tenerife Plan, specifically, mandated a three-step application of this doctrine. Concentrated suppression. The leading English ships, under Vice Admiral John Bourne and Captain Richard Stainer, were ordered to bypass the outer defenses and anchor directly opposite the main fortress, San Cristóbal. This was a suicidal commitment, a point-blank duel. However, by concentrating the fire of multiple ships onto a single, narrow sector of the rampart, Blake ensured that the Spanish guns in that area were overwhelmed, structurally compromised, and effectively silenced within the first hour. This required absolute command adherence to the fire plan. There was no room for error or hesitation. Systematic engagement and destruction. Once the main fortress was suppressed, the ships would shift fire systematically, utilizing their maneuverability, limited though it was, to target the secondary batteries and, finally, the enemy fleet. Crucially, the fleet's destruction was primary. The Spanish ships, packed tightly within the harbor and relying on the forts for protection, were sitting targets once the forts were neutralized. The impossibility of retreat, a command philosophy and unspoken, yet powerful, tenet of this doctrine was the elimination of a safe option for retreat. By entering the harbor against the wind, Blake ensured that a quick, unhindered exit was physically impossible until the wind shifted or the tide turned favorably. This was a deliberate command decision designed to remove any psychological safety net for his captains. They knew they had to succeed in their destructive mission because their only path out was the same path they took in, demanding a pause and a calculated risk on the wind change. This level of absolute commitment amplified their aggressiveness. This Forgotten Doctrine was the true weapon at Tenerife. It was a technical, clinical response to a tactical problem, proving that conventional naval wisdom could be shattered by a commander willing to leverage close-range gunnery and demand absolute discipline, even at the cost of his own ships. Blake's genius was in seeing the flaw in the enemy's confidence, the moment where their impregnable defense became their inescapable prison. The popular image of Admiral Blake at Tenerife is one of an unhindered commander, leading a perfectly equipped force to glory. This romanticized view deliberately overlooks a crucial, insidious reality. The expedition was severely undermined by a supply chain crisis orchestrated not by the enemy, but by passive-aggressive obstruction from within the Commonwealth's own political infrastructure. The logistical failures preceding the raid were not accidents. They were acts of hidden betrayal intended to ensure Blake's failure, thereby discrediting his radical doctrine and removing a formidable political rival. The demands of Blake's doctrine, rapid, concentrated fire in a closed theater, required absolute material perfection. His ships needed gunpowder of the highest grade, cordage capable of withstanding extreme strain, and masts and spars robust enough for the tight maneuvering under fire. What he received, however, was a litany of deliberate deficiencies. The records of the Victualling Board and the Ordnance Department reveal a pattern of slow walking and substitution. Ship stores were delayed for weeks, forcing Blake to sail later than strategically advised. When the supplies finally arrived, the quality was demonstrably inferior. Gunpowder arrived damp or with a high charcoal content, severely degrading the critical rate of fire that his entire tactical plan depended upon. Cordage was brittle, risking snapping crucial rigging during the stress of battle, a near-fatal risk when maneuvering in the constricted harbor of Santa Cruz. These were not isolated incidents of bureaucratic inefficiency. They were the tangible consequences of the institutional myopia described earlier. The conservative factions within the Council of State and the Admiralty who opposed Blake's impossible strategy exerted their influence by weaponizing the supply chain. They did not have to issue a direct order to abort the mission. They simply ensured the material conditions for success were degraded to the point where failure was overwhelmingly probable. This manipulation was a form of political hedging. If Blake failed, the detractors could point to his rashness and the inevitable loss of valuable ships, while attributing the failure to poor supply rather than their own malicious intent. If, by some miracle, he succeeded, they would rush to claim credit for authorizing the expedition, simultaneously burying the evidence of their sabotage. The common sailor paid the price for this treachery, forced to fight against a heavily armed foe with substandard equipment. Crucially, Blake was fully aware of the material deficiencies. His final dispatches before the attack reveal a grim acknowledgement of the situation, a clear indication that he understood he was operating with a margin of error that his government had deliberately shrunk. This awareness amplified the true burden of command. He had to compensate for the deficiencies not merely with courage, but with an even greater level of tactical precision and an unyielding will. Every successful broadside, every maneuver, and every surviving ship at Tenerife represented not just a victory over the Spanish, but a defiant rebuttal of the treacherous political machinations back in Whitehall. The crisis of logistics was thus the hidden variable of the entire operation. It necessitated the speed and ruthless destruction that followed, forcing Blake to commit to a strategy of total annihilation to prevent the Spanish from having the time to exploit the inevitable technical failures caused by inferior English supplies. The battle was fought not on equal terms, but with Blake's genius struggling against the systemic incompetence imposed by his own political elite. The immense pressure placed upon Admiral Robert Blake was magnified exponentially by a factor rarely acknowledged in the official histories: the devastating deterioration of his personal health. By the time the fleet reached the Canary Islands, the heroic commander was, by all medical accounts, a dying man. He suffered severely from dropsy, edema, likely complicated by congestive heart failure, and the advanced stages of scurvy, conditions which rendered him frail, often incapacitated, and in persistent, debilitating pain. This grim medical reality placed an unbearable weight of destiny upon the operation. For Blake, the raid on Santa Cruz was not just the pinnacle of a strategic campaign, it was likely his last will and testament. He was fighting against the Spanish, the elements, and the passive betrayal of Whitehall, all while battling a mortal illness that afforded him no respite. This personal crisis lent a fatalistic urgency to his command decisions. Knowing his time was limited, he could not afford the cautious, drawn-out maneuvers favored by traditional admirals. The victory had to be swift, total, and executed immediately, or it would never happen at all. This context transforms the narrative of the raid from one of simple military calculation into a profound study of the true burden of command. While his subordinates were tasked with technical execution, Blake bore the comprehensive responsibility. The political betrayal that compromised his supplies, the institutional doubt that challenged his doctrine, and the physical agony that threatened to break his resolve. The common soldiers looked to him not just for orders, but for the unwavering image of courage, an image he had to project even as his body failed him. The fact that Blake remained on the quarterdeck, directing the engagement with clinical precision, is a testament to his sheer will. His illness forced him to delegate, but never to surrender control. His focus was sharpened by the knowledge of his imminent mortality. There was no second chance, no opportunity for a subsequent campaign. Every detail of the focused aggression doctrine, every calculated risk, became non-negotiable. His decision to commit the fleet to an all-or-nothing assault against the wind, eliminating the possibility of a safe retreat, was surely influenced by his personal desperation to deliver a final, crushing blow to the enemy before death claimed him. This element of mortal urgency also acted as an unexpected catalyst for his forces. The officers and men, fully aware of their admiral's precarious state, witnessed his commitment firsthand. This silent, suffering leadership solidified the bond between command and crew, transforming the daunting mission into a personal vendetta and a shared moment of ultimate dedication. They fought not just for the Commonwealth, but for the honor and the legacy of the dying admiral who risked everything to prove his genius and fulfill his duty to the very end. The final, magnificent destructive act at Tenerife was therefore not just a strategic victory, but Blake's final, definitive answer to his political detractors and, in a profound moral sense, his own self-willed act of destiny against the tyranny of his failing body. The catastrophic failure of the Spanish defense at Santa Cruz de Tenerife lay not in a lack of resources, but in a crippling misplaced hubris and a profound defensive blindness within the command structure led by General Don Diego López de Hox. This fatal confidence, rooted in centuries of successful logistics and the overwhelming strength of their fortifications, was the very weakness that Admiral Blake had ruthlessly calculated to exploit. The core of Spanish error was their reliance on the theory of unassailability. They had positioned the entire silver fleet in Santa Cruz because the harbor was, by every established naval doctrine, safe. The topographical funnel of the bay, combined with the heavy firepower of the Castle of San Cristóbal and the Castle of San Juan Bautista, led the Spanish commanders to believe that no foreign admiral would dare commit his valuable ships to such a constrained and lethally defended space. They believed their defenses were a deterrent in perpetuity. This hubris translated into strategic rigidity and complacency. Don Diego's command focused exclusively on preparing for the anticipated naval action, a traditional blockade or a hit-and-run privateering raid on the periphery. They failed to conceive of, or prepare for, Blake's radical, high-commitment frontal assault. Spanish doctrine dictated that the forts were the primary defense. The fleet's role was secondary, to provide fire support and protect the transfer of the silver, not to engage in a decisive battle. Consequently, the Spanish ships were packed tightly within the harbor, a configuration optimized for rapid unloading, but which became a dense, immobile target once the primary defensive umbrella was lifted. The defensive blindness was manifest in several key tactical errors. Failure to vary the defense depth. The Spanish relied almost entirely on their heavy, fixed coastal cannon. They failed to adequately position lighter, mobile artillery on the outer slopes or to mine the shallow approach areas. Their fire plan was static and predictable, designed only for a distant engagement, leaving them unprepared for the close-quarters suppression Blake demanded. Over-reliance on elevation. Don Diego and his engineers overestimated the advantage of the high-mounted fort guns. They believed the height would grant them a perpetual edge, failing to account for the crucial close-range phenomenon where a ship's low-angle broadside could be effectively directed at the vulnerable embrasures and gun crews themselves, leading to a rapid and localized suppression of fire. Logistical bottleneck in the harbor. The Spanish ships were moored in a manner that created a severe fire hazard. Their tightly packed formation, while space-efficient, maximized the spread of fire once Blake initiated his destructive phase. Had they been dispersed, or had critical lanes been maintained, the conflagration would have been manageable. Instead, the tight configuration ensured the total destruction of the fleet. In essence, the Spanish High Command allowed their confidence in the fortifications to substitute for dynamic strategic thinking. They failed to acknowledge the possibility of a genius who would deliberately discard the rules of engagement. They prepared for a conventional war, and Blake delivered a technical siege. Don Diego López de Hox, facing the sudden, aggressive commitment of the English fleet, was paralyzed by this defensive blindness. His response was delayed, indecisive, and ultimately futile. He was unable to redeploy his men from the now silenced forts to the ships in time, and his captains were caught in an inescapable trap of their own making. The destruction of the Silver Fleet was, therefore, a monumental failure of Spanish command foresight, a consequence of allowing deep-seated institutional pride to override necessary tactical flexibility. The success of Blake's audacious plan was not born of blind courage, but of meticulous, almost obsessive intelligence gathering, a forgotten tactical prelude that constituted an intelligence coup against the overconfident Spanish. The doctrine of focused aggression demanded absolute precision. Sailing into a harbor like Santa Cruz required knowing the precise location and effective range of every Spanish cannon, the depth of every anchor point, and the complex, unpredictable nature of the local currents and winds. Blake understood that without this granular data, his operation was suicide. The core of this intelligence coup was a series of high-risk, low-profile reconnaissance missions executed in the weeks leading up to the main assault. These were often conducted under the guise of neutral fishing vessels or by small, fast frigates that crept close to the coast under the cover of night or adverse weather. The official narrative glosses over the perilous work of the men tasked with these missions, yet their findings were the navigational and tactical prerequisites for the entire operation. The intelligence gathered focused on 4 non-negotiable data points that debunked the Spanish assumption of invulnerability. Precise ranging of shore batteries. Blake needed to know the maximum effective range of the Castle of San Cristóbal's heavy guns and, more importantly, their minimum depression angle. The reconnaissance teams risked capture to chart the precise elevation of the fortifications relative to the sea level. This confirmed Blake's hypothesis. Once a ship was within a certain, critically close distance, the high-mounted guns could not be depressed low enough to strike the ship's hull with devastating horizontal fire, forcing them to rely on inaccurate plunging shots. This specific knowledge was the technical key to the entire operation. Hydrographic survey of the harbor floor. The shallow, rocky portions of the harbor were potential traps. Small boats discreetly sounded the harbor, mapping the depth curves to identify the narrow, safe channels through which the larger English warships could sail and anchor. This data dictated the exact anchor points for the English line of battle ships, ensuring they were positioned to bring their full broadsides to bear against the forts without running aground, a critical logistical achievement that negated the Spanish belief that the shallows would protect their fleet. Mapping of Spanish fleet configuration. Through covert observation, Blake's intelligence confirmed the tight, static formation of the Spanish Silver Fleet, anchored close to the shore defenses. This intelligence confirmed their defensive blindness and the optimal angle for the English ships to achieve maximum, concentrated fire against the packed hulls of the treasure ships once the forts were silenced. It also provided crucial information on the location of the most valuable vessels, allowing Blake to prioritize their destruction. Analysis of the prevailing wind and tidal cycles. The most complex and vital piece of intelligence concerned the meteorological conditions. Santa Cruz is notorious for its fickle winds. The reconnaissance established a pattern, confirming that the prevailing wind necessary for a rapid, controlled exit often shifted in the late afternoon. This knowledge was directly incorporated into the command decision. The attack had to commence early enough to ensure that the initial suppression and destruction were complete before the necessary wind shift occurred to facilitate the impossible retreat. This was the only element of the plan that relied on timing and environmental factor, turning it from a matter of luck into a calculated temporal risk. This meticulous gathering of tactical data, detailed, dry, and entirely technical, was the true foundation of the victory. It transformed a reckless proposition into a geometrically sound military calculation. It proved that Blake was not a mere adventurer, but a forgotten genius whose strategic audacity was perfectly matched by his thoroughness in reconnaissance, giving him a technical advantage that the complacent Spanish command never suspected. The hour of the attack was dictated by the intelligence gathered. It was to be at dawn, the precise moment of tactical transition where the morning haze offered brief concealment and the defensive garrisons were at their most fatigued. But the first, decisive move of the raid was Blake's counterintuitive maneuver, a decision that instantly signaled the all-or-nothing nature of the command and shattered the predictable expectations of the Spanish general Don Diego. Blake ordered his lead ships, commanded by the aggressive Captain Richard Stainer and Vice Admiral John Bourne, to sail directly into the harbor entrance against the prevailing wind. This was a deliberate act of tactical self-denial. Conventional naval strategy mandated entering with the wind to retain the option of a quick, unhindered retreat should the shore fire prove too heavy. Blake, however, was eliminating that option entirely. By battling the wind and current to gain the initial anchorage, he ensured that for his captains, retreat was impossible until the critical afternoon wind shift, many hours away. The message was absolute and unambiguous. Success was the only route out of Santa Cruz. They were committed to a fight to the death, transforming the fleet into a static, unflinching siege battery. The English formation was a masterpiece of focused aggression. The fleet did not enter haphazardly. It was arranged in a tight, concentrated column, designed to minimize exposure during the approach while maximizing the broadside impact upon anchoring. The most heavily armed ships, the vanguard, were designated to sail past the outer batteries and drop anchor at point-blank range, just outside the minimum depression angle of the main forts, a distance measured with lethal precision by Blake's prior reconnaissance. As the leading ships, led by the Speaker and the Bridgewater, made their relentless, slow progress against the wind, the Spanish garrison was jolted from its complacency. The first shots fired were Spanish, heavy cannonballs plunging toward the difficult-to-hit English decks. The Spanish assumed the fleet would pause outside the defensive arc, exchanging distant, cautious fire. They were profoundly wrong. The English response during this crucial dawn approach was an exhibition of severe discipline. Blake had mandated that the ships were to hold fire, enduring the opening Spanish salvos without reply. This silence was not a sign of fear, but of calculated aggression. Every ounce of gunpowder and every gunner's energy was being conserved for the moment of maximum destructive effect. This stoic approach was devastating to Spanish morale. They fired at targets that seemed determined to close, ignoring all conventional caution. The critical phase of the approach concluded when Stayner's vanguard finally reached their designated anchor points, arrayed in a compact, overlapping line directly opposite the massive Castle of San Cristóbal. With the anchors dropped and the ship stabilized, a feat of seamanship under fire, the English ships were perfectly positioned for the next phase. They were where the Spanish believed no ship could survive, close enough to neutralize the high-angle fire and positioned to concentrate a devastating, continuous torrent of shot. The entire maneuver, battling the wind to commit the fleet to a trap of its own making, was the single boldest tactical decision of the day. It was the moment that turned a mere attack into a siege, replacing the uncertainty of maneuver with the cold, hard geometry of Blake's Forgotten Doctrine. The English had successfully committed themselves to an inescapable duel, forcing the Spanish to fight a war of technical suppression for which their defenses were utterly unprepared. The time for silent commitment was over, the time for concentrated fire had arrived. The Spanish defensive strategy at Santa Cruz was predicated on the geometric synergy between the natural topography of the harbor and the formidable, fixed artillery platforms of its fortifications. For Admiral Blake to succeed, this technical perfection had to be systematically broken. A detailed examination reveals why the harbor was universally regarded as the most secure staging post for the Silver Fleet. The defensive perimeter consisted of a coordinated, mutually supporting network of batteries, but the overwhelming strength resided in two principal fortresses and the surrounding terrain. The Castle of San Cristóbal, the citadel. Positioned strategically on the most commanding section of the shoreline, the Castle of San Cristóbal was the anchor of the defense. This massive stone citadel mounted the heaviest concentration of large-caliber cannon, primarily demi-culverins and culverins. These guns fired 9-pound and 18-pound shot, respectively, and were designed for long-range interdiction and hull-shattering power. Technical advantage: the castle's elevation was its perceived greatest asset. Standing high above the waterline, the guns enjoyed a plunging fire trajectory. This allowed the Spanish to aim at the unprotected decks and rigging of approaching ships, causing catastrophic structural damage and widespread crew casualties. Furthermore, the thick masonry walls, designed to absorb centuries of wear, rendered the fort largely impervious to the kind of standard cannonades that ships exchanged with one another. Blake's knowledge of its minimum depression angle was, therefore, the key to neutralizing this colossal advantage. The Castle of San Juan Bautista, the Black Fortress, located on the opposite flank, closer to the shore and the inner anchorage, was the Castle of San Juan Bautista, often referred to as the Black Fortress due to the dark volcanic rock used in its construction. While slightly smaller, its role was crucial, to deliver raking fire across the beam of any ship that successfully passed the citadel. Technical advantage: this fort provided an interlocking field of fire, ensuring that any English ship anchored to engage San Cristóbal would simultaneously expose its flank to San Juan Bautista. Raking fire, delivered along the length of the ship, was the most devastating form of naval damage, capable of dismounting multiple cannon and shattering bulkheads with a single shot. The coordination between these two major forts created a lethal crossfire zone at the mouth of the harbor, making a static engagement conventionally impossible. The lesser batteries and topography. Supplementing the two major castles were a number of smaller, yet lethal, earthen and stone batteries dispersed along the coastline and embedded into the natural volcanic ridges. These batteries, armed with lighter caliber pieces, were designed to fill any potential gaps in the heavy cannon coverage and were incredibly difficult to spot and target from the water. Crucially, the topography itself was a weapon. The high, jagged ridges surrounding the bay prevented the use of supporting troops for any land-based assault and, most importantly for the naval engagement, created unpredictable, localized wind and current patterns. This instability made it extraordinarily difficult for English ships to stabilize their platforms for accurate gunnery, while the fixed, stable batteries faced no such challenge. In summary, the Spanish defense was a layered system of geometric destruction. The forts were built high to ensure plunging fire, positioned to ensure devastating crossfire, and protected by terrain that hindered English maneuvering and obscured lesser batteries. Conventional naval doctrine was clear: no wooden warship could sustain fire from such a technically sophisticated, fixed defensive line long enough to silence it. Blake's Forgotten Doctrine required a tactical genius that understood these technical advantages not as insurmountable obstacles, but as flaws to be exploited by sailing into the very geometric sweet spot of danger, where the fort's maximum elevation rendered them blind. With the English vanguard committed against the wind, anchored at the perilous point-blank range dictated by Blake's intelligence, the suppression phase of the attack commenced. This was the moment of truth for the Forgotten Doctrine, a direct, bloody test of Blake's conviction that massed naval gunnery could overpower fixed stone fortifications. The accepted narrative dictates that this was a duel, but in reality, it was a rapid, one-sided technical neutralization orchestrated by command precision. The lead ships, under Captain Richard Stainer, did not engage in the cautious, one-by-one firing typical of fleet actions. Blake's orders were absolute: a concentrated, continuous, overwhelming volley of fire focused exclusively on the embrasures and gun ports of the Castle of San Cristóbal, the most powerful fortress. This was the application of the principle of focused aggression. The Spanish gunners, initially confident in their elevation, found themselves facing a phenomenon they had neither anticipated nor trained for. The English ships, positioned precisely where the fort's guns struggled to depress sufficiently, were not receiving the expected, devastating hull shots. Instead, the Spanish fire was either sailing harmlessly overhead or striking the upper rigging and forecastles, painful, but not immediately catastrophic. The English broadsides, however, were delivered with brutal efficiency. The sheer density of Blake's heavy ordnance, culverins and demi-culverins, firing almost simultaneously, created a continuous, deafening wave of concussion and iron. The goal was not to shatter the entire fortress wall, which was impossible, but to methodically destroy the functionality of the battery. Every shot was directed at the openings from which the Spanish guns fired, dismounting the cannon, collapsing the protective wooden traverses, and, most critically, annihilating the gun crews. The rate of English fire was the critical differentiator. Blake's disciplined crews, drilled specifically for speed, maintained a cadence that the Spanish, despite their static platforms, simply could not match. The Spanish gunners, facing relentless, targeted bombardment at almost kissing distance, could not reload, swab, and traverse their heavy cannon under such continuous pressure. As Blake predicted, the intense, close-quarters fire created a localized hell of smoke, splintered stone, and flying shrapnel, achieving psychological paralysis and physical suppression of the Spanish response. Within an hour of engagement, the fire from San Cristóbal, though initially ferocious, began to falter, then become sporadic, and finally, fall silent. This was the signal achievement of the doctrine. The sheer weight of English metal had not breached the walls, but it had rendered the great fortress militarily inert. The gun crews were killed, wounded, or driven from their posts, and the operational capability of the battery was destroyed. This sudden silencing of the primary defensive anchor marked the decisive moment of the entire battle. It validated Blake's entire, controversial strategic framework and opened the operational window for the next phase. The ships had endured the initial barrage, proved the unconventional physics of close-range naval assault and effectively removed the most powerful weapon in the Spanish arsenal. Now, with the greatest threat neutralized, the English ships could turn their attention to the lesser batteries and the sitting targets of the Silver Fleet itself. The calculated risk had paid off, transforming the Castle of San Cristóbal from an impregnable shield into a monument to Spanish defensive blindness. The furious suppression of the shore batteries was sustained by a logistical effort below deck that defied the typical chaos of 17th-century naval combat. Blake's Forgotten Doctrine demanded an unsustainable rate of fire, transforming the orderly decks into a hell's cape of smoke, noise, and backbreaking labor. The victory at Tenerife hinged not only on the courage of the gunners but on the logistics of chaos managed by the powder monkeys and the tireless reloading crews. In a conventional engagement, a warship's rate of fire was limited and punctuated by long pauses. Blake's plan, however, required the ships to function as rapid-fire, mobile siege batteries, necessitating a continuous, elevated output that strained every man and every resource. The entire supply chain within the hull was optimized for this tempo. The powder management imperative. The most critical resource was gunpowder. The sheer volume of continuous broadsides threatened to deplete the magazine at an alarming rate. Blake's meticulous organization mandated an efficient, almost industrial flow of powder from the secured magazines, deep in the ship's hold, to the gun decks. Powder monkeys, usually young boys, served a vital and perilous role, carrying the powder charges in specialized cartridges or leather buckets. Their path was a narrow, smoke-choked gauntlet. Any accidental spark or dropped lantern could result in an instant, catastrophic magazine explosion, a risk heightened by the constant shock of enemy fire. The quality of this powder, as detailed earlier, was often inferior due to the political sabotage of Whitehall. This compounded the logistical challenge. Inferior powder generated more smoke and residue, requiring more frequent and thorough sponging of the gun barrels between shots to prevent dangerous, self-ignited misfires. This extra step further reduced the available time for reloading, making the discipline of the crews all the more vital. Sustaining the rate of fire. To maintain the required rate of fire, Blake's crews were drilled to execute a precise, synchronized dance of war that involved up to 12 men per heavy gun. The sequence was mercilessly swift. Running out, the gun, recoiled by the force of the previous shot, had to be hauled back into firing position using tackles and crowbars. Sponging and worming, a critical step involving the swabbing of the barrel with a wet sponge to extinguish any remaining embers, followed by the use of a worm to ensure no fragments of the previous cartridge remained, a preventative measure against a premature explosion upon reloading. Loading, the insertion of the powder charge, followed by wadding, and finally the iron shot. Pricking and priming, piercing the cartridge and adding the finer priming powder to the touch hole. Aiming and firing, the gun captain, often working in near-zero visibility due to the thick smoke, had to adjust the elevation and traverse before applying the match. The success of the suppression phase hinged on the fact that the English crews could execute this sequence significantly faster and more consistently than their Spanish counterparts. This allowed the English to deliver perhaps 3 to 4 broadsides for every 2 that the Spanish forts could manage. This disparity in the velocity of destruction was the technical application of Blake's doctrine. Working in the logistics of chaos. The environment on the gun decks was a sensory overload of noise, heat, and confusion. Discipline was the only thing standing between victory and mutual annihilation. Officers had to enforce a rigorous control over the remaining supplies, knowing that every barrel of powder was irreplaceable. The constant fire meant that damaged tackle, dismounted guns, and wounded men required immediate attention without breaking the relentless rhythm of the broadside. This organized chaos ensured that the Spanish received a continuous stream of punishing fire that degraded their defensive capability faster than they could respond, ultimately proving that superior internal logistics and technical discipline could overcome the formidable external advantage of stone fortifications. It was a victory won not just by the captains on deck, but by the relentless, unsung labor of the crews below. With the catastrophic silencing of the main shore batteries complete, the engagement entered its decisive and most destructive phase, the ship-to-ship engagement and the fire strategy. The primary defensive umbrella had been collapsed, exposing the Spanish Silver Fleet, anchored tight against the shoreline, as vulnerable targets. This phase was defined by a shift in English focus from suppression to systematic annihilation, a tactic demanded by the logistical and time constraints of the operation. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Don Diego, found itself in an immediate, inescapable trap. The tightly packed arrangement, designed to maximize safety under the protection of the shore forts, now maximized their vulnerability. The English ships, already anchored and stabilized after the grueling suppression phase, could now pivot their concentrated firepower onto the dense cluster of enemy hulls with devastating effect. The engagement that followed was less a traditional naval battle and more a controlled demolition. Blake's objective was not to capture the ships, the risks of sailing them out of the constricted, dangerous harbor were too high, but to ensure their total, permanent destruction. The English captains, having successfully neutralized the forts, maneuvered slightly to gain optimal raking positions against the Spanish hulls. Raking fire, delivered along the length of a ship from bow to stern, travels the maximum distance through the vessel, dismounting multiple guns, shattering bulkheads, and causing the highest possible casualties. The incendiary imperative. The centerpiece of this phase was the calculated and relentless application of Blake's fire strategy. The goal was to ignite a self-sustaining conflagration among the tightly packed Spanish vessels. English gunners began utilizing specialized incendiary shot, hot shot or fire arrows, alongside their conventional iron rounds. This was a critical tactical choice. The wooden hulls, dry rigging, and tightly stored cargo of the Spanish treasure ships were highly combustible. The ensuing destruction was rapid and total. The flames, fanned by the unpredictable harbor breezes and fed by the ship's own internal stores, quickly spread from one vessel to the next. The Spanish crews, already demoralized by the inexplicable silencing of their forts, struggled to cope. The limited space prevented effective countermaneuvering, and the proximity to the shore, which they believed to be their salvation, now blocked any attempt at escape or dispersal. They were pressed against their own burning defense. Blake's discipline held firm, the destruction was to be total. The English ships maintained their position, providing continuous fire support to ensure that no Spanish captain could extinguish the flames or attempt to scuttle his vessel in a controlled manner to save the neighboring ships. The sound of exploding powder magazines and the sight of mast and sail collapsing into the water signaled the utter failure of the Spanish defensive strategy. The failure to counterattack. Don Diego López de Hawks and the remaining Spanish command were paralyzed. Their attempts to organize a counterattack from the shore were futile. The surviving garrison troops, disorganized and leaderless after the suppression of the batteries, could not effectively bring light arms or secondary weapons to bear against the English ships anchored so closely. They were reduced to watching, helpless, as the economic heart of their empire went up in smoke. This phase, lasting only a few terrifying hours, was the final, brutal validation of Blake's genius. He had transformed the most fortified harbor in the Spanish global network into an incineration chamber for the very wealth it was designed to protect. The technical victory of suppressing the forts led directly to the tactical and economic triumph of destroying the fleet. The mission was nearly accomplished, but the most hazardous maneuver, the escape, still lay ahead. The success of the suppression phase and the subsequent incineration of the Spanish vessels presented Admiral Blake with a final, crucial command decision, a choice that defined the operational ruthlessness of the raid. The decision to scuttle the Spanish fleet entirely rather than attempt salvage. This act marked the definitive point of no return, transforming the objective from plunder to absolute economic annihilation. For any commander, the immediate temptation following such a crushing victory would be to secure the prize. The Spanish silver fleet was laden with bullion, a fortune that could instantly solve the Commonwealth's crippling financial crisis and reward the fighting men. However, Blake, the strategic engineer, coolly assessed the logistical impossibility and the intolerable risk involved in capturing the treasure. The simple physics of the harbor made salvage a fool's errand. The constricted, high-risk channel that the English ships had battled to enter was a death trap for the Spanish galleons. These large, cumbersome treasure ships were not designed for rapid, controlled maneuvering under fire, especially not against the prevailing headwind and unpredictable currents. Even if the English had captured every vessel intact, the process of jury-rigging them, staffing them with prize crews, and navigating them out of the harbor under the residual and potentially renewed fire from the surviving Spanish garrisons was a recipe for catastrophe. Blake risked losing more ships attempting to salvage the prizes than he had lost during the entire engagement. The core principle of the mission was strategic disruption, not mere profit. Blake's genius lay in recognizing that the economic value of the fleet was neutralized simply by its destruction. He was conducting a preemptive siege on the Spanish crown's financial future. The cost to Spain of the total loss of the bullion, and the ships built to carry it, was immeasurably greater than the value of the silver itself. The orders issued were therefore clinical and direct: complete destruction by fire. Captains were instructed to ensure the Spanish ships were burning fiercely, beyond any hope of controlled salvage by the enemy. This focus on total annihilation was the final, defining act of the focused aggression doctrine. It was a measure designed to maximize the economic shockwave and minimize the tactical risk to the English fleet. The men, the common sailors who had risked their lives, might have felt a surge of disappointment at the loss of prize money, but the professional officers understood the brutal necessity. This decision underscored the deep, systemic difference between privateering and state-level economic warfare. The raid was a political act, and the destruction of the fleet was the most powerful, lasting political statement possible. By turning the valuable hulls and their precious cargo into ash, Blake reached the point of no return. He ensured that the English fleet would not be tempted to linger or compromise its disciplined exit strategy. The fire, which consumed the Spanish economic lifeline, simultaneously served as a massive, visible signal to London and Madrid. The most impregnable fortress was vulnerable, the entire system of Spanish silver defense had been proven fallible, and the English Commonwealth had dealt a blow from which the Spanish Empire would not swiftly recover. The act of scuttling was, in essence, the final, decisive cannon shot of the raid. The destruction of the Spanish silver fleet was an act of tactical supremacy, yet the most anxious and technically difficult phase of the raid remained: the impossible retreat. Blake had deliberately committed his ships against the prevailing wind, ensuring a fighting commitment, but this now meant that attempting to sail out of the constricted, heavily fortified harbor against that same wind was a nautical impossibility. The triumphant ships were effectively trapped in a lethal funnel, vulnerable to any renewed fire from the surviving Spanish garrisons once the smoke cleared. Blake's solution to this final, critical challenge was not another feat of aggression, but a testament to his profound understanding of maritime meteorology, turning a calculated environmental risk into the ultimate instrument of his escape. This relied entirely on the detailed intelligence gathered prior to the attack regarding the local wind and tidal cycles of Santa Cruz. The reconnaissance had confirmed a phenomenon unique to the harbor: the prevailing wind, which had forced the English ships to laboriously beat their way into the bay, often shifted dramatically in the late afternoon, known locally as the sea breeze phenomenon. This shift, caused by the heating of the landmass, could reliably introduce an offshore wind, pushing directly out of the harbor mouth and toward the open sea. Blake's entire operation, therefore, was designed around a temporal deadline dictated by this wind change. The suppression and destruction phases had to be completed before the sea breeze arrived, turning the same environmental factor that had previously been an obstacle into a means of salvation. As the last of the Spanish treasure ships burned and the primary tactical objective was secured, Blake issued the complex, coordinated orders for withdrawal. This was a maneuver demanding absolute precision from every captain and every sailor, especially given the state of the ships, many battered from the suppression fire, with damaged rigging and stressed hulls. The technical execution of the exit. The retreat involved a synchronized dance of seamanship. Preparation under pressure. While the Spanish guns were silenced, the English crews rushed to make emergency repairs. Damaged sails were patched, critical rigging was reinforced, and anchors were readied for immediate hauling. This work was conducted under the constant anxiety of a potential Spanish counterattack or the revival of a silenced fort. The anchor management. To exit the harbor effectively, the ships could not simply rely on the wind. They utilized a technique known as kedge anchoring. Ships dropped smaller anchors ahead of them, then used their capstans to pull themselves forward, shortening the distance until the new offshore breeze could catch their sails fully. This slow, deliberate movement was a necessity in the constricted channel. The harnessing of the sea breeze. As the onshore wind slackened and the offshore sea breeze began to fill the sails, the fleet executed its most difficult maneuver. The ships, starting from a near-static position, had to catch the first breath of the new wind, setting a precise course that avoided the known navigational hazards and the remaining firing arcs of the lesser Spanish batteries. The new wind, which had been the enemy's silent guard, now became the English fleet's powerful, time-limited towline. The precision of the timing was the technical masterpiece of the retreat. Had the destruction phase taken an hour longer, or had the intelligence on the wind shift been flawed, the fleet would have been trapped, forced to endure fire until nightfall, likely leading to catastrophic losses. Instead, ship after ship, moving in a disciplined, controlled column, caught the offshore wind and slowly but steadily gained the safety of the open ocean. The impossible retreat was the final, elegant validation of Blake's methodical approach. He had conquered the fixed defenses with firepower, and he conquered the natural elements with foresight. The sight of the English fleet, damaged but intact, sailing away from the harbor, leaving behind a sky black with the smoke of the destroyed Spanish fleet, was the ultimate psychological blow to the Spanish command. It proved not just that the English could attack the Impregnable, but that they could escape it, turning the enemy's own geography against them. The immediate, celebratory dispatches sent back to Whitehall hailed the raid on Santa Cruz as an almost bloodless miracle, a clean, surgical strike that resulted in the annihilation of the Spanish fleet for a negligible cost to the Commonwealth. This was a narrative crafted by political necessity, and it deliberately obscured the sober assessment of the butcher's bill, the true human and material cost of Blake's genius. The victory was immense, but it was not cheap. It was a desperate close-run thing that nearly tipped into catastrophe. English casualties, the true cost of suppression. The official records, often cited as gospel, place English casualties at around 50 killed and 120 wounded. A revisionist assessment, however, accounting for the unique nature of the engagement and the political pressures involved, suggests this number is a serious underestimation. The most intense part of the battle was the suppression phase, where the English ships anchored at point-blank range and deliberately exposed themselves to the high-caliber, albeit misaligned, fire of the Spanish forts. While the heavy shot failed to strike the hulls with devastating frequency, the fire that did hit was concentrated on the rigging, upper works, and gun decks. Cannonballs tearing through the confined gun decks and falling wreckage from the masts and spars caused horrific casualties. Furthermore, the immense stress of maintaining the high rate of fire under the chaotic conditions led to several documented accidental explosions on the gun decks, the human cost of which was often conveniently logged as battle wounds or simply omitted from the final tally to maintain the narrative of a pristine victory. The true cost was likely closer to double the official count, with a significantly higher ratio of grievously wounded men, sailors requiring long-term care that the government, as we shall see, was reluctant to fund. The men who secured the victory were often left to bear the physical and financial burden of their sacrifice, a harsh reflection of the moral compromise embedded in the political leadership. Spanish losses, total annihilation, minimal bloodshed. The Spanish losses, conversely, were catastrophic in material terms but surprisingly limited in human life, especially among the garrison troops. The goal of the raid was economic annihilation, and in this, Blake succeeded absolutely. Fleet loss. The entire Spanish Silver Fleet, estimated at 16 to 18 major warships and supporting vessels, was utterly destroyed, either sunk or deliberately burned to the waterline. This represents a total loss of naval assets and, critically, a loss of the infrastructure required to transport the massive amounts of American silver. Economic loss. The silver itself, though partially unloaded and hidden, was not the entirety of the cost. The loss included the irreplaceable hulls, rigging, stores, and, most damagingly, the delay and disruption to the annual flow of commerce, which led to a collapse of credit in Madrid and Genoa. The economic shockwave rippled across Europe, confirming the strategic importance of the total destruction. Spanish human casualties were minimized by two factors: the rapid suppression of the fort crews and the deliberate English focus on burning the ships rather than boarding them. The garrison troops, once the forts were silenced, largely abandoned their posts rather than engaging in a fruitless land defense against the ships. Material costs to the Commonwealth. The English fleet, though victorious, was heavily battered. Several ships required immediate, extensive repairs, having suffered significant damage to their masts, rigging, and sails, the very damage that the politically compromised supply chain had failed to mitigate beforehand. This material cost, borne by the Commonwealth, further angered Blake's detractors, who viewed the expenditure of state resources, even for a victory, as evidence of the inherent recklessness of his aggressive doctrine. The Butcher's Bill confirms the tension at the heart of the raid, an unparalleled strategic victory achieved through impossible commitment, but paid for by the blood of forgotten men and the strain on a fleet whose supplies were deliberately compromised by a treacherous political elite. The destruction of the Silver Fleet at Santa Cruz instantly unleashed an economic shockwave that rippled across the financial capitals of Europe, profoundly disrupting the fragile credit structures underpinning the Spanish Empire. The raid was not simply a military triumph. It was a brutal, decisive act of state-level economic warfare whose repercussions were immediately and severely felt, particularly in Madrid, which responded with a strained, telling silence. The economic hemorrhage. The Spanish crown, under King Philip IV, relied entirely on the annual arrival of the Carrera de Indias to underwrite its vast expenditures, service its colossal national debt, and fund its standing armies across Flanders and Italy. The silver acted as immediate collateral for loans from Genoese and German bankers. The moment news of the fleet's total annihilation reached the continent, the entire Spanish financial system experienced a liquidity crisis. The destruction of the ships was not just the loss of physical treasure, it was the loss of anticipated credit. Bankers, whose wealth was tied up in promissory notes and bonds secured against the value of the incoming silver, immediately panicked. The Crown's credit rating, already precarious, plummeted. Interest rates on any potential new loans skyrocketed, making it virtually impossible for Madrid to raise the necessary funds to maintain its imperial commitments. The immediate consequence was a default on various financial instruments. The Crown could not pay its foreign troops, nor could it honor its contracts with its suppliers. For a nation already engaged in protracted, costly wars, this economic paralysis was arguably more damaging than the loss of 1,000 men. The raid did not just burn ships, it torched the financial confidence of Spain's international creditors, proving that their most valuable asset was not merely vulnerable, but wholly indefensible. The wealth of the New World was useless if it could not be safely brought to Europe. The silence from Madrid. In Madrid, the response from the royal court was one of strained, almost petulant silence, followed by an almost immediate campaign of official denial and systematic obfuscation. The sheer scale of the disaster was too immense, too humiliating, to be publicly acknowledged in full. To admit that an entire treasure fleet, the symbol of Spanish imperial power, had been completely destroyed within a fortified harbor by a single enemy commander was to confess to a catastrophic failure of military, logistical, and political competence. The silence was a tactical political necessity. Philip IV and his ministers knew that full disclosure would incite panic among the populace, provoke further hostility from Protestant powers, and lead to an immediate, unbearable increase in domestic taxes, which would threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. Therefore, the official reports minimized the losses, emphasizing the bravery of the garrison and attributing the English success to an unnatural, momentary shift of the wind, turning Blake's strategic timing into an act of mere luck. Crucially, this official denial also served to protect the reputations of the Spanish commanders, such as Don Diego López de Hox. While undoubtedly disgraced, his fate was handled quietly, without the public fanfare of a court-martial. The political elite understood that to publicly prosecute their commanders for failing to defend the Impregnable was to publicly acknowledge that the Impregnable was, in fact, entirely assailable. The facade of imperial invulnerability had to be maintained at all costs, even at the expense of honesty and accountability. The economic shockwave and the subsequent political silence from Madrid confirmed the profound strategic success of Blake's raid. England had not just won a battle, it had exposed the economic brittleness and the political cowardice at the heart of the Spanish Empire. The smoke from the burning ships was a signal fire across Europe. Spain was faltering, and its financial dependency was its Achilles heel. The arrival of the news of the total destruction of the Silver Fleet at Santa Cruz ignited not celebration, but a frenzy of political maneuvering within the Council of State and the corridors of Whitehall. For the ruling elite, Blake's victory was an inconvenient truth, a strategic triumph that exposed their own institutional failures and forced them to manage a narrative that minimized their own obstruction while maximizing their political gain. Whitehall's spin, claiming credit, masking treachery. The immediate priority for Cromwell's government was to transform the victory into a powerful piece of Commonwealth propaganda. The focus shifted entirely away from the near-catastrophic logistical failures and the institutional resistance Blake had faced. The official dispatches and public pronouncements were carefully crafted to attribute the success solely to the providence of God and the foresight of the Protectorate itself. The political spin was twofold. Divine sanction. The victory was framed as the ultimate proof of God's blessing upon the Protestant Commonwealth, thereby granting the regime the moral legitimacy it constantly craved. The miraculous nature of the retreat, the timely wind shift, was emphasized not as a piece of meteorological intelligence, but as direct divine intervention. This neatly bypassed any uncomfortable questions regarding Blake's technical genius or the flawed nature of the campaign's supplies. Credit appropriation. The self-serving factions in the Admiralty and the Council of State, who had actively opposed Blake's plan and compromised his supplies, were the first to rush forward to claim credit for authorizing the bold design. They portrayed themselves as far-sighted strategists who had trusted Blake despite the risks. This maneuver was a cynical attempt to bury the evidence of their prior obstruction and to neutralize the powerful political capital Blake had just accrued. The goal was to render Blake a powerful, yet politically safe figure, a tool of state destiny rather than an independent strategic mind who had exposed the incompetence and treachery of the ruling class. The plight of the forgotten heroes. This official spin necessitated a deliberate neglect of the human cost and the forgotten heroes, the common sailors and junior officers who bore the true burden of the command. While the politicians praised the victory in Parliament, they simultaneously demonstrated a profound moral callousness toward the men who achieved it. The soldiers and sailors who survived the point-blank suppression phase returned not to generous rewards, but to a struggle for survival. The butcher's bill, the high number of grievously wounded men, required substantial governmental expenditure for pensions and long-term care. The very same politicians who lauded the heroism of the fleet now exhibited deep reluctance to approve the necessary funding. The severely wounded, those whose limbs were shattered by cannon fire and whose lungs were ravaged by the noxious smoke of battle, were often relegated to meager stipends or left dependent on private charity. The political elite prioritized the symbolic value of the victory, the economic shockwave and the blow to Spain, over the human cost paid by the working men who were injured and disabled. This blatant disregard was the ultimate act of political treachery. The Commonwealth was willing to use Blake's genius and the sailors' blood to secure its own financial and political stability, but it was unwilling to honor the unwritten contract of care and compensation. The victory was claimed by the state. The sacrifice was borne by the individual. Admiral Robert Blake's return from the triumphant, yet devastating, raid on Santa Cruz was not a glorious homecoming, it was a race against his own mortality. His physical health, already severely compromised by dropsy and scurvy before the engagement, collapsed under the extreme strain of the campaign. The final, poignant act of his life was his desperate struggle to reach the shores of England one last time before death claimed him. The race against mortality. After the harrowing escape from Tenerife, the fleet was forced to sail immediately for home, the battered ships in need of extensive repair and the admiral in need of urgent medical attention that the ship's surgeons could not provide. Blake's final days were marked by immense suffering, yet his intellect remained sharp and his resolve unbroken. He endured the long voyage, driven by an unyielding desire to deliver his final report and witness the recognition of his doctrine before his end. The tragedy of his passing is etched in the detail of history. Blake died at sea, on August 17, 1657, within sight of Plymouth, the very coastline he had fought so hard to defend and enrich. He did not live to set foot on English soil again or to hear the formal gratitude of the Parliament he served. This death, occurring at the moment of victory's celebration, lent a dark, elegiac tone to the entire achievement. The denial of full recognition. Blake's death presented his political opponents in Whitehall with a final, convenient opportunity to shape his mortal legacy and deny him the full recognition his unparalleled achievement warranted. While Cromwell, as Lord Protector, ordered a magnificent state funeral, a necessary public gesture to honor the hero who had secured the Commonwealth's finances, the underlying political animosity persisted. The conservative factions sought to control the narrative of his genius. They praised his courage and zeal, qualities they could safely champion, but they deliberately failed to grant full, public institutional acceptance to his radical strategic doctrine. To formally endorse Blake's principle of focused aggression would be to admit that their own traditional, risk-averse naval philosophy had been fundamentally wrong, and that their prior obstruction had been dangerously misguided. The resulting recognition was therefore grudging and politically neutered. Parliament approved a sum for his burial and erected a monument, but the strategic lessons of Tenerife, the technical brilliance of neutralizing shore batteries, were not immediately codified or integrated into the mainstream naval curriculum. The victory was treated as a singular, miraculous event attributable to Blake's unique character, not as the validation of a transferable, repeatable military science. The institutional resistance to change, the institutional myopia, proved more tenacious than the Spanish forts themselves. Blake died not only without the full physical recognition of setting foot on shore, but also without the full professional recognition that would have enshrined his doctrine in naval law. His mortal legacy became a battleground where his military genius was celebrated on the surface, while the political establishment worked assiduously to disarm the revolutionary implications of his strategy. He achieved the impossible odds at sea, only to be defeated by the political inertia of his own government upon his death. The thunderous destruction of the Spanish silver fleet at Santa Cruz, though immediately hailed as a strategic masterpiece, forces upon history an unsettling moral reckoning. The ultimate question posed by the raid is not how Blake achieved the impossible, but whether the victory was worth the true human and political cost, a cost that the triumphant politicians in Whitehall deliberately sought to obscure. The moral cost. Sacrifice and neglect. The most profound moral deficit of the Tenerife victory lies in the disparity between national glory and individual sacrifice. Blake's victory was purchased with the suffering and deaths of common sailors, many of whom were casualties of the close-range fire and the systemic failures of the supply chain orchestrated by Blake's political enemies. The moral calculus is unforgiving. The wealth accrued, or, in this case, the wealth denied to the enemy, was used to stabilize the fragile Commonwealth regime and enrich the opportunistic factions within the Council of State. Yet, the injured men, the forgotten heroes who ensured the success of the suppression phase, were subsequently abandoned. The failure of Parliament to adequately fund pensions and care for the wounded was a profound moral betrayal. It confirmed that for the political elite, the lives of the lower ranks were purely transactional, valued only for the military service they provided, not for their inherent human cost. Blake's victory was exploited as a political tool, while the men who wielded that tool were left broken. This remains the victory's darkest and most enduring stain. The enduring political legacy, doctrine versus dogma. Despite the political spin that attempted to dilute Blake's strategic genius, the raid forged an enduring, if subterranean, political legacy. Blake's demonstration that ships could successfully defeat shore defenses fundamentally altered the political and technical calculus of naval power. It permanently shattered the myth of the impregnable fortress and forced subsequent naval powers to drastically re-evaluate coastal defense. However, the political establishment's resistance to change was equally enduring. Though the technical success of the focused aggression doctrine was undeniable, the high-risk, high-cost nature of the victory allowed the conservative elements to prevent its immediate, full integration into the Admiralty's operational standards. It became a strategic footnote, a brilliant but unrepeatable anomaly, rather than a foundational principle. The political class preferred the safety of traditional, predictable maneuvers over the terrifying, politically volatile genius of Blake's methods. The ultimate political legacy of Robert Blake is that of a strategic martyr. He proved that an individual's exceptional genius could overcome both the systemic failures of a complacent enemy and the deliberate treachery of his own government. His death, within sight of home, symbolized the final, tragic victory of political expediency over strategic truth. He handed the Commonwealth a lifeline, a crucial economic victory, but in return, he received a state funeral and a calculated denial of the full, revolutionary implications of his tactical doctrine. In the final unsettling reckoning, the raid on Santa Cruz stands as a powerful, ambiguous testament. It is the defining moment of English naval audacity, but it is simultaneously a searing indictment of the political class that sacrificed its soldiers and denied its greatest strategist his full recognition in favor of maintaining institutional dogma and financial self-interest. The smoke from the Spanish Silver Fleet eventually cleared, but the moral and political questions raised by the victory remain, questions that expose the true, hidden cost of a triumph born of impossible odds and forgotten genius.